Hi, my name is Steve Benton, and I have been working with the Montagnards for 25 years now. And I've been working for foreign exchange students. It wasn't my main job. That was a separate job that I'd had that was just a volunteer thing. I was born up in Virginia, and it's in a town outside of Washington, D.C. that was still pretty rural. And my activities involved hunting and fishing and camping and all that kind of stuff that you get to do when you live in a rural area. That was something that I was doing, and that kind of set me in line. I went to high school at a school called Annandale High School. And I was never a good student. I was not interested in academics at all, really, and I was interested in sports.
Oh, wow.
So in high school, I was a pulver and a gymnast, and I tried running some short, long-distance runs they had for high schools then. They were 2.5 miles. And that was what I was really interested in. By the time that I finished high school, there was not a single place left that I used to go hunting or fishing or canoeing or camping.
Wow.
It was all gone. It had all been turned into high-rise apartments and housing developments. It was just been really fast, and it just destroyed the place in my mind. And so it was time for me to think about going to college. I had a number of friends who had applied to college down in North Carolina, East Carolina. It was East Carolina College at the time. It was cheap. It was cheaper to go there out of state than it was to go to any of the colleges in Virginia. And so that's I did, and I went down, and there was 10 or 15 students from Annandale from my class that went down there at that time. I started off in majoring in physical education. I was an athlete. Quickly I realized that was not what I wanted to do. But then I was in a dilemma because I didn't really know what I wanted to do. So I tried a number of different majors and really stuck. And I hit on anthropology. Anthropology was very interesting. In fact, that was something that I was interested in from the time I was a child. If we played cowboys and Indians, which kids always did back then, I was always one of the Indians. And so I was just fascinated with indigenous people. And of course, we had none around that I could go and meet. That was what I was, an indigenous people. And so I got into anthropology, and I was very happy with that, and I stayed with that almost until the end. I started getting upper level classes, and one of the things that started bothering me was that in anthropology, especially ancient stuff, nobody could agree. Everybody had theories about this and that and the other, but nobody would agree to anything anybody else said, and it was very frustrating. So I decided, well, I need to look around at something else maybe, and wound up another thing that I did when I was a kid was to play around in the creeks and stuff across the street from my house, trying to figure out why these piles of sand were in the bottom of these creeks and why these piles of sand moved. And somebody else told me, oh yeah, there's groundwater down there too. You could go next to the creek and dig a hole. You were going to run into water under the ground. And wow. And that kind of fit in with the other thing that I was interested in as a kid was things like volcanoes, glaciers, storms. Those things just fascinated me. In fact, when I was very young, I spent Hurricane Hazel up in the top of a pine tree being blown all over the place. So that was another interest in my life that was part of me. So I went on. I started off in anthropology, and I heard there was this new geology professor that had just come to the University of East Carolina, and he was young and enthusiastic and interested in research and things like this, and very dynamic. And I just was hooked. and I took the beginning geology classes of 1 year, and that up and did very well. And at the end of that, this professor come and talk to me and this one other student from his class about spending the summer working with them out in the field. They were going to do a study of the estuaries in North Carolina. And so I said, "Whoa, yeah," but they didn't have any money. They were just new professors, and so our pay was food. And their wives were very good cooks, and they fed us well, except for lunch. And at lunch, we were working out on the water, and so there was no McDonald's to go to or anything like that. And so we canned soup that you could just open and eat raw. Oh. And actually, I still do that to this day. So that's actually pretty good. You might want to try that sometime.
Okay.
But anyhow, it was a one experience, and I got an introduction to research, how it's done, what it involves, a lot about the coast of North Carolina, and it was I'm going to be a geologist. But the point is that I had 4 years of college, and at that time they were drafting people to go into the war in Vietnam. And I had a low number, and so I knew that I was doomed. And so I was able to get into the Seabees. My dad helped with that. And my dad had been a Marine, and he knew better than to try to be a Marine.
Okay. What is CB?
A CB is a construction battalion.
Okay. And
what they do is they have an area, and they are needed for landings on islands and stuff like that, airports. And in Vietnam, what they were doing was working a base that we had, and building a bridge that had been destroyed, rebuilding that, and a hospital, airport, things like that. And to the CB, I went in, and everything went fast. Boot camp, boom, and then down to my home base, which was in Gulfport, Mississippi. And that didn't last long either. We kept, we were scheduled to go into to Vietnam early fall, and so I had basically 8 months in country. In the U.S. getting ready for going to do this, and came up to Camp Lejeune and did some training up here. I learned how to use a mortar, and that was my specialty for in any combat type of stuff. So anyhow, it was the thing. And at the end of after I'd gone into the military, by the summer I was off. Down going to it was kind of bizarre. When we flew into Vietnam. We flew in on airplanes that were they were not commercial aircraft, but they looked like commercial aircraft. And they had people would just contract with them, and they had hostesses and all this kind of stuff. And there we were all sitting in the seats with our greens and our M16s. And our duffel bags, and a regular airplane with hostesses. That was bizarre. And then we flew in. When we flew into Vietnam, we flew into Da Nang, which is a pretty good sized city, and it's on a big bay, and it's really beautiful. Mm-hmm. But it was scary because that's when we come land, so nobody knew anything about what was going to happen really. Mm-hmm. Well, and then they took us from Da Nang up to our home port on a smaller airplanes, C-130s, and eventually with just trucks and stuff after we landed in Hue. And our base was a place called Quảng Trị. It was originally very close to the border of North Vietnam, but they had too much trouble with people in Vietnam shooting at North Vietnam shooting at us with mortars and rockets and stuff, and they were hitting the base, and it was not good. So they moved the base. That was one of the things we worked on was fixing the base that had just been moved. We were a mile or two from the DMZ, even with the base being moved. It was a very big base. There was thousands of troops from Marines, a bunch of troops there, and then there were 700. The CBs go someplace as a battalion, And so we were a battalion, and we had our own little part of the base right in the middle. And it was they had plywood, which was worth its weight in gold. And so so we all had we had little huts and stuff to live in, whereas most of the Marines and the other guys had tents and things. And so all the Marines would come and hang out at our clubs, and for some reason the Seabees and the Marines got along really well, and didn't get along with any of the other people on the base. So that was kind of an interesting thing.
Yeah.
But the word fighting from the DMZ. It goes in Vietnam from south to north. It's called Highway 1. Mm. And then right at the DMZ, there's another road that goes from east to west, and it's called Highway 9. And all the famous bases that you hear about in the war in Vietnam were along Highway 9. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And so it went all the way to Laos. Mm. And from our base, we were close to the coast. We could look over into the distance and see these mountains. And they were just so beautiful. And I really wanted to go and visit these mountains. Because, I mean, that's where I grew up in Virginia. We went to the mountains. And I also heard about the Montagnards from people. And I was, wow, indigenous people, this would be, I'd go meet these people. But they never would let me go. I mean, it was a war going, and they just don't let you go wandering around, with one exception. And it turned out that one of to our battalion was also what they call win the heart and minds of people.
Okay.
And so they were these little programs that were pretty small, and like we foremen would go in basically by themselves to a village, and they'd have stuff and take care of them. And then the idea was to give the Vietnamese that lived there some idea that, hey, we're not bad guys, that we're here to help them. But everybody else was not doing their part of that job, I'm afraid. There was a lot of times I was not real proud to be an American over there, things that I saw. But it's war. War is just not good. But I met this corpsman, and he was telling me about what he was doing, and I said, hey, can I go? And so I became a member of this help the hearts, win the minds of the people. Just two of us. Mm. And he spoke fluent Vietnamese. Wow. And he taught me a bunch of phrases. And so we would catch local transportation. We'd fly right up and down the river in a long boat that was powered by usually women on the back of the boat with this long oar that goes out the back. And I never could understand how that made that boat go down the river, but it did. And so we would catch that boat, and we would go someplace as close to a village that we were supposed to go to as possible, and then we'd hike in from there or catch a ride with somebody going in. And then we'd go into the village, and we'd be speaking Vietnamese. And the people thought this was wonderful, because the Americans didn't treat the Vietnamese with any respect at all. In fact, the name that we had for Vietnamese was Gook, which, as you can imagine, is not a very pleasant name. It's like the words we've used here for our indigenous people and native people. They heard us speaking the language that would impress us. They would immediately take us to the chief's village, the chief's house rather, and we'd sit in there with tiger beaters the whole time we were there, and all the villagers would come, and we'd talk to the villagers and find out who was hurting and stuff and take them. And I had toothbrushes and toothpaste and pass that out, and soap. We would spend half a day or so there, and then we'd head back. And that to me was this was wonderful. And it gave me an insight into who the people of Vietnam are. Not the people in the cities, but the people out in the country. And I became very good friends with some of them. Some of them actually worked on our base. And there was one lady that would bring me lunch every day. So I learned about Montagnard, or not Montagnard, but Vietnamese food, which is actually really good, but it's spicy. And so that was my introduction to the indigenous people. I could look in the distance and see their mountains, and wish I could go there, but never allowed to go. But I got to know the other people who were very similar,
Mm.
and people of Vietnam.
Yeah.
And
Do you know what tribe that group was?
no,
No. Okay.
I can't. I never mentioned a tribe
Okay.
in the Vietnamese, amongst the Vietnamese.
Okay.
But they had, I mean, everything was very similar to the way the Montagnards that I later learned lived their lives. They had a village chief. He was in charge of spread, of passing out the land. And so it's actually really communism that we were there protecting, fighting against communism.
Mm-hmm.
But that was their culture, and it was very similar to the Montagnards I later learned.
Okay.
So that was my introduction.